Ever opened Microsoft Teams and thought, why are there so many channels, half of them unused, and nobody really knows where to post? You're not alone. Teams can quickly become chaos if the structure isn't clear. But here's the real question. Is the idea of the perfect team setup just a myth, or is there actually a playbook that works? Stay with me, because we'll break down the hidden principles behind collaboration that either make Teams a mess or make it your most powerful digital workspace. Why Teams often feels like digital chaos. Picture this. You open Microsoft Teams on a Monday morning and instantly see 20 different channels in your team. A few are active, but half haven't been touched since the last financial year. Others are duplicates with slightly different names, so you're never quite sure which one has the latest discussion. It looks busy, maybe even comprehensive, but the question is, does this actually improve productivity or simply bury it under noise? For many of us, the answer feels obvious. Instead of making things simpler, this sprawling layout turns every quick check-in into a digital obstacle course. The reality is that a lot of organizations rush into Teams without any blueprint. They set it up quickly, spin up channels for every possible topic, and then hope people will figure it out. The intention is good, cover all bases, create space for every conversation, but without planning, all that effort leads to confusion instead of clarity. You end up with a system that looks impressive at first glance, but secretly makes collaboration harder. What's meant to be a central place for working together starts to feel scattered and disorganized. And here's the twist. Adding more tools doesn't magically improve teamwork. In fact, the opposite often happens. The more cluttered a team's environment becomes, the less likely people are to adopt it fully. They drift back to email or instant messages because it feels easier than sorting through endless channels. This quiet resistance isn't always visible on dashboards, but over time it erodes adoption and undermines the promise that teams were supposed to deliver. I once worked with a project team who believed the best way to capture discussions was to create a separate channel for every single topic. At first, it sounded like a dream. Budget discussions in one space, marketing updates in another, technical tasks in their own channel as well. But soon, nobody could keep track of where conversations belonged. Routine updates were missed because they ended up in the wrong channel, documents were uploaded twice, and the search function showed duplicates everywhere. After a few months of frustration, the group quietly returned to relying on email. The tool was sitting right there, but people abandoned it because the setup made more work than it saved. There's evidence showing this isn't just anecdotal. Studies of digital collaboration consistently find that unmanaged channel structures where nobody defines purposes or responsibilities lead to significantly lower engagement. It's not that people dislike Teams. It's the friction that comes from uncertainty. Without defined lanes, the effort to track information increases and attention spans shrink. Think about it like this. Imagine walking into an office building with 30 perfectly good meeting rooms. They're all available, but none of them have signs to show who is using them or what purpose they serve. You might book one and hope you're not interrupted, or maybe avoid using them altogether because the rules aren't clear. The result is wasted potential. The building itself isn't the problem. The lack of structure is. What's tricky with Teams is that the productivity drain isn't loud or obvious. There's no alarm that goes off when channels overlap or when purposes are vague. Instead, the cost is hidden. People spend extra minutes figuring out where to post, or worse, they stop bothering to share updates at all. Work slows down in small increments, and before long, the culture of collaboration feels less energized. You might not even notice until someone asks, why are we still sending important updates by email? The important insight here is that most chaos in Teams doesn't come from the tool itself. The issue sits in how we design and guide its use. Without clear principles and a practical structure, Teams is vulnerable to sprawl, repetition, and confusion. But when we simplify, tighten the layout, and give every channel a clear function, things start to flow. So the key takeaway is simple. Clarity beats quantity. More channels don't mean better collaboration. More apps and tabs don't equal more efficiency. What matters is that people know where to go and why. That certainty cuts through the noise and builds trust that the tool is worth using day in and day out. Which brings us to the bigger question. If chaos is the trap, then what does a functional structure in Teams actually look like? The science behind effective Teams structures. What if the idea of the perfect number of channels isn't just workplace guesswork, but actually follows the same patterns as how our brains process information? When we think about how people absorb and organize details, there's a clear line between too much and too little. That's where cognitive load theory comes in. It basically says our mental capacity is limited. If we overload people with options, they struggle to navigate and make good decisions. At the same time, if we strip away too much choice, they hit a wall and can't find space to sort and group their work. The sweet spot is somewhere in between. And that concept applies directly to how teams should be structured. Organizations often fall into the trap of swinging between extremes. On one side, you might see a one-channel-fits-all setup, where every message, update, or decision gets posted in a single, overloaded space. New hires open that channel and scroll forever, trying to find what actually matters. On the other side of the spectrum, you find teams that take an every possible angle approach. They spin up a dozen or even a few dozen channels, one for budget, one for coffee breaks, one for a project that ended last year, and then wonder why nobody knows which one to use. And the result is either digital noise stacked all in one place or fragmentation so severe people end up avoiding the whole system. Take a real scenario to see how this plays out. A marketing department tried to keep it simple. They set up just 2 channels, a general space and one called campaigns. The problem was predictable. Every type of update, vendor feedback, design drafts, customer insights, and management requests got funneled into just those 2 spaces. By Friday, conversations were buried so deeply that the team had to chase updates in private chats. On the flip side, an engineering group in the same company took the opposite path. They created 25 channels, each dedicated to a very narrow task. While it looked neat on paper, in practice, the team struggled to keep track of which channel to check. Small updates were ignored because teammates simply didn't have the time to monitor that many feeds. 2 different approaches, 2 forms of frustration. This isn't an unusual situation. Microsoft has explored patterns of digital collaboration across industries, and the findings are interesting. What their data shows is that it isn't about hitting a specific number like 5 is perfect or 12 is the maximum. Instead, teams that perform well frame their channels around their actual workflows. In other words, the structure reflects how the work moves, not how many topics could theoretically exist. It means aligning channels with roles, responsibilities, and recurring processes rather than brainstorming a list of every possible subject. To make sense of it, think of a library. If the library had only one massive pile of books at the entrance, nobody would be able to find what they needed. But if every single sentence of a novel had its own shelf, the experience would be equally unusable. What makes libraries functional is that they group content into broad, logical sections, fiction, history, science, so you can locate information without drowning in detail or missing the nuance. That same principle applies to structuring teams' channels. The goal isn't to cover every conceivable category. The goal is to create a structure that makes sense for retrieval and action. So this raises a practical question. Is there actually a channel sweet spot where structure supports flexibility without letting things splinter into chaos? The answer is yes, but it doesn't come in the form of a magic number. It comes in the form of clarity. Clarity of purpose within each channel and clarity for the team about what belongs where. That's the pivot point that separates a setup that feels natural to use from one that people dread opening. What this leads to is pretty straightforward. The best teams' environments don't measure success by how many channels they've built, but by how clearly those channels are defined. A team might function beautifully with 6 because each one aligns perfectly with a process. Another group might need 12 because their responsibilities are more diverse. It's not quantity that makes the difference, it's purpose. The key takeaway is this: an effective team structure is less about chasing after an ideal number and more about ensuring that every channel plays a defined role in the workflow. When teams stop guessing about numbers and start focusing on alignment, they move out of chaos and into cohesion. But there's a catch. Even the best structure can crumble if the way people communicate inside it isn't deliberate and consistent. And that's where the real separation between struggling teams and successful ones happens. Communication principles, not just layout, determine whether the system keeps working or falls apart. Communication principles that separate winners from losers. 2 teams can sit side by side with the exact same channel layout, yet one becomes a lively hub where ideas flow while the other collapses into silence. You don't even need to change the number of channels, tabs, or apps to see this happen. The difference usually comes down to a less visible factor: communication principles. These are the unwritten rules, or sometimes the explicitly documented ones, that guide how messages, updates, and decisions actually move through the system. Without agreed expectations, the structure is just a static frame. With them, the same structure becomes a working environment that people trust. The reality is many teams groups never take time to set those norms. They create a few spaces, invite the right people, and then assume everyone will figure it out organically. That assumption works for a week or 2, but soon the cracks start to show. Someone posts a status update in the general channel when leadership expected it in announcements. A critical task request lands in a chat while others are buried under a thread most people didn't even see. Soon enough, the group wastes precious time clarifying not the work itself, but simply where the work should have been communicated. It's not a technology failure, it's a lack of shared ground rules. I watched this unfold with a product rollout team. They had a general channel, an announcements channel, and a handful of functional spaces for design, testing, and customer feedback. On paper, it looked fine. But during the rollout, updates scattered between general and announcements because nobody ever decided which one was the authoritative source for key information. Team members checked both or sometimes neither because they weren't sure what was most relevant. Within a month, the group stopped using announcements entirely, and coordination slipped back into scattered chats and email threads. A channel meant to centralize vital updates became irrelevant simply because no one agreed on its purpose. That silence in announcements wasn't laziness, it was disengagement born from confusion. When you look at high-performing teams, the contrast becomes clear. These groups don't wait for problems to surface. They spell things out from the start. They write down where project updates should go, how quickly responses are expected in each channel, and what to do if something urgent needs escalation. That might sound like overkill, but it creates alignment. Everyone understands the playing field, so the tool itself feels reliable. Even something as basic as saying, reports always go in the reports channel and we use announcements only for leadership updates can save hours of chasing down the right message later. Think of it like urban planning. You can have a city with perfectly paved roads, brand new intersections and plenty of wide lanes. But if there are no traffic lights, no yield signs and no agreed rules of the road, you're just inviting chaos. Cars may still move, but accidents happen daily, and eventually drivers start avoiding certain streets altogether. Teams without defined rules follow the same pattern. The roads are there, but the flow becomes unpredictable and frustrating. This is why structure alone isn't enough. You can invest effort into setting up a neat channel hierarchy, but if people don't share the same understanding of how to use it, the system collapses. Left unchecked, this lack of norms breeds frustration until eventually users disengage. Worse, they start inventing their own rules on the fly, which leads to inconsistency between individuals, and the whole purpose of collaboration platforms erodes. The most effective teams environments lean on three simple but powerful principles: clarity, consistency, and accountability. Clarity ensures that everyone knows where a certain type of message belongs. Consistency makes sure the habits stick day after day rather than drifting back into old patterns. Accountability gives the group a way to remind each other when the norms slip, so the principles are more than just words. Together, these create trust in the system, which is the foundation of active participation. So the takeaway here is straightforward. Success doesn't come from the layout of the channels, it comes from the culture the group enforces through their communication norms. Technology provides the scaffolding, but culture decides whether people want to use it. Once those principles are locked in, the next challenge becomes equally important: building the skills and competencies needed so that every person on the team actually knows how to use the platform to its fullest. That's where the idea of an ideal teams team starts to look less like a myth and more like a reachable goal. Competencies that unlock the ideal teams team. Why do some teams' environments still fail even after the structure looks solid and the rules are written down? You'd think if the channels are clear and the posting norms are agreed upon, the rest would take care of itself. But that's where a lot of organizations get blindsided. Structure and principles set the stage, but without the right competencies, people stumbling through the tool will derail everything. Teams isn't just a platform for clicking around, it's a way of working. That means the real test comes from whether users actually have the skills and habits needed to use it well. Here's where the gap shows up most often. Teams rollouts usually focus on what goes where and how channels are named. What gets left out is the human behavior piece. Many teams assume people will just figure things out naturally, like knowing when to use chat versus posting in a channel, or how to manage threaded conversations without creating 3 competing discussions on the same update. The reality is people don't figure it out as quickly as we think. And when they're unsure, they fall back on old habits like email chains and local file storage. That fallback keeps the organization stuck halfway between the old system and the new one, which makes teams look less effective than it actually is. I saw this firsthand with a finance department that had been given a pristine Teams environment. The channels were clean, posting guidelines were written out. Adoption at first looked promising, but soon after launch, collaboration slowed. The root cause wasn't structure, it was skills. No one in the group knew how to properly integrate shared files into channels. They defaulted to attaching Excel sheets to emails because they were nervous about overwriting documents in Teams. Instead of building one source of truth in the Files tab, they created 5 different copies floating around in inboxes. Predictably, version control became a headache and frustration set in. The blame didn't fall on Teams itself. The issue was that nobody had been trained on how to work with files directly in the tool. Competence in Teams is about more than where do I click. It's about understanding the intent behind each feature. Knowing the difference between chat and channel isn't trivial. It changes how the team captures context. A private chat is good for quick one-to-one nudges, but it makes no sense for team-wide updates that need to be searchable a year later. Threaded conversations might look intuitive, but without practice, people end up replying in the wrong place, which fragments the entire discussion. And then there are integrated apps like Planner, OneNote, or Power BI. Without the skill to incorporate those into the workflow, most teams never go beyond chats and file sharing. They end up driving only in first gear, even though the platform is built with multiple gears for different needs. Think of this like handing someone the keys to a Formula One car. The technology is top of the line, but without the training to handle the speed, the steering, and the techniques of racing, the driver won't even leave the pit lane. They might start the engine, but they'd never perform to the car's potential. Giving teams to employees and expecting full efficiency without training works the same way. Tools amplify skills, and without the skills, the amplification just magnifies confusion. Competencies directly shape adoption, and adoption shapes trust. When a user knows how to confidently share files, search past threads, or schedule meetings inside the platform without feeling clumsy, they start trusting the tool. That trust pushes them to use it more, and the loop continues. The opposite happens when competencies are missing. The first misstep leads to frustration, which leads to retreating back to email and eventually to a collective view that Teams doesn't work. The truth is the platform isn't failing. It's the missing competencies that hold it back. Once skills are developed, though, something interesting happens. Teams stops being just another app on the desktop and becomes the single pane where collaboration flows. Meetings connect straight to documentation, chats link to action items, and updates live in spaces where the whole group can find them. The friction falls away and the culture begins to shift. It's no longer about chasing down who has the latest file or where a conversation happened. Work becomes visible, aligned, and much faster. This is the payoff. Competencies unlock what structure and principles alone cannot. They take the system from looking organized on paper to working effectively in reality. The so-called ideal team starts to look less like a fantasy and more like an achievable state once people know how to use the environment confidently. And that brings us back to the bigger question. Now that we've seen structure, principles, and competencies as the three pillars, is the idea of an ideal team still a myth? Or is it a practice that can actually be sustained? The ideal team, myth or achievable reality? After everything we've talked about, it comes back to the original question. Is the idea of a perfect team even real? For some people, the answer is easy. They'll tell you it doesn't exist, that the very nature of collaboration platforms means they naturally spiral into clutter over time. But others argue the opposite. They see the ideal not as some flawless state you can achieve once and keep forever, but as an ongoing process of maintaining structure, principles, and habits. The division often falls between skeptics who think chaos is inevitable and optimists who view order as something that can be sustained with deliberate effort. Let's be honest, the skeptics aren't entirely wrong. If you talk with IT leaders who've managed Teams environments for a few years, you'll hear the same frustrations repeated. A carefully designed setup launches well, but after 6 months, channel bloat creeps in. A year later, old projects linger with half-empty spaces, new teams spin up without following naming conventions, and norms drift as people come and go. Left on its own, even the tidiest tenant will eventually look messy, and that's why there's a perception that the ideal is impossible, because any system left unattended will slide toward disorder. But here's the counterpoint. Messiness doesn't mean failure if you approach Teams as something that requires governance, renewal, and reinforcement. There are plenty of examples where organizations not only maintain their team's environment, but actually see engagement improve over time. The difference isn't magic, it's discipline. They build governance so that new teams and channels follow guidelines instead of random creation. They support competencies by giving people tools, training, and clarity to feel confident using the platform's features. And they reinforce communication principles so everyone follows the same playbook instead of inventing their own rules. Put those three things together and you get longevity, not decay. One multinational organization illustrates how this works. They had reached a point where thousands of teams existed globally, many of them half-used or abandoned. Productivity slowed because employees never knew which team to rely on for updates around projects spanning different countries. Adoption reports showed usage leveling out and even dropping in some regions. To fix it, leadership didn't restart from scratch. Instead, they launched a restructuring plan that focused on workflow-based teams. They pruned inactive spaces, defined standards for new ones, and provided targeted training. Within a year, they didn't just reduce clutter. They saw adoption rates rise dramatically because staff finally trusted the environment as predictable and useful. That turnaround didn't happen because they created the perfect setup once. It worked because they built a system for continuously keeping it aligned. This is why the idea of an ideal Teams team needs redefining. The ideal isn't static perfection. It's not a magical design you land on just once. It's a maintainable state of clarity where structure meets principles supported by competencies and refined over time. Think of it less like completing a puzzle and more like managing physical health. You don't exercise 1 week and then declare yourself in perfect shape forever. You stay active, adjust based on age and lifestyle, and build habits that keep you on track. Teams works the same way. There's no such thing as a permanent ideal body for a collaboration platform, but there is a practice that sustains health and performance. The encouraging part is that many organizations and teams are closer to that state than they realize. Once you look at your own setup, you often find that about 80% of the foundation is already there. The channels may just need better labeling, the rules might need refreshing so people know what goes where. And skills might require topping up so users feel confident handling files, threads, and apps. These aren't radical overhauls, they're adjustments. And when done repeatedly, they raise the environment back toward clarity. So when someone asks if an ideal Teams team is a myth or a reality, the answer is that it exists, but not as a perfect once-and-done outcome. It exists as sustained practice, a combination of structure that supports workflows, principles that guide communication, and competencies that empower people to use the tool fully. When those three meet, the platform evolves with the team instead of decaying under it. That's not a myth, that's a management choice. And that leaves one last piece to consider. If the ideal is possible as a practice, then the real question isn't whether it exists. The question is what changes you and your team are willing to make next so that your own team's setup moves closer to that state every day. The perfect team setup isn't about chasing flawless design. It's about shaping habits, defining structures people actually use, and reinforcing a culture that makes communication predictable. The tool can't carry the weight on its own. Teams have to shape how they work inside it. So here's the challenge. Look at your own team setup and find just one change that could simplify or clarify the way your group communicates. It doesn't need to be massive. Even one improvement builds momentum. The real test isn't whether the ideal exists, it's whether your team is willing to build it step by step,